Sunday, this Sunday, June 23rd. You're all invited. We're going to have an open house, and it's going to be put on by the Historical Society and in conjunction with Barbara Dix's children and grandchildren. And the open house is to honor Barb's umpteen years of service as Oswego County historian, town of Schroeppel historian, and Village of Phoenix historian, among all the other things that she has done in her career. So, no, she did retire from the town, but not from the village or from, and she doesn't work for the county any longer. We do have a new historian for the county, but she's still village historian. So anyway, we'd like you to come and congratulate her, and it's going to be, did I say her 90th birthday? I think on Tuesday, 2 days later. So anyways, the Catholic Church is allowing us to park over there, so there'll be plenty of parking. So please make it if you can.
2 to 4.
2 to 4, I didn't say that, did I? It's right on my card too. It's right here, yep, on Sunday. Upcoming, we expect to have our annual blueberry sale. Usually they're ripe the third weekend of July. So we're anticipating that, and we'll have more out on that. And the last thing I did want to mention is we did republish the Grips books on Phoenix, New York. If anyone doesn't have one, we have the hardcover version for sale, and there's tons of history in there about Phoenix. It was first written in 1902. So most of the stuff in there covers the 1800s, and it's lots of pictures and stuff. So you can see any one of our board members tonight. And I did forget one thing. For the blueberry sale, we will need bakers of blueberry items. So we'll be putting something out on that. So that's all I have to say on that. So tonight, we have Dr. Jeff Ludwig, who is Director of Education for the Seward House Museum. Right?
That's right.
And he's also a TV personality. And I say that because after he sent us his picture to put on our poster, I was watching a PBS documentary one night on Harriet Tubman, and there he was on the show. So, and you've done others.
I've done a few others.
So,
and tonight as well.
So with that, I'll
thank you so much.
Thank you.
How's the quality of the video? Great. Then if it's
Want any lights off?
no, hopefully you can all hear me. I will boom and project my voice, and if you need me to go louder, I'll get louder. I'll do my tour guide voice. It's such a pleasure to be here. This is a really beautiful space, and I'm very thankful to the Society for having me, and to Steve for continuing to find ways for us to work together across organizations and chapters of history lovers here in Central New York. It's an election year. I can hear the groans. Maybe we don't want to talk about that. So let's instead go back in time, not quite 200 years ago, and look at a very different cycle of American electoral politics. If I can get a quick show of hands, who's been to the Seward House before? Actually, almost everybody, almost literally everybody. That's terrific. If it's been a while or you were just there yesterday, hopefully there'll be enough in here that you will be caught up to speed. But I dare say you're all historians and history aficionados, so you know the heart of the Seward story. And I imagine when you think about him, you're thinking about him in Washington, D.C. You're thinking about him as a U.S. Senator taking to a national stage, representing New York and voicing the opposition to slavery in the lead up to Civil War. After that, you're probably thinking about him as Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, by the president's side, all the way from the inauguration, the Emancipation Proclamation, Gettysburg, Appomattox, and assassination. But this Seward did not just appear one day and spring out of the soil of Cayuga County, ready to go to Washington and take on these causes. He is formed in early politics, in New York politics, in his 20s and 30s. And my argument for everyone here this evening is going to be, if we read backwards into Seward's especially 2 terms as New York's 12th governor, we can see the seeds of all the causes he advanced being planted as he's a young man in his 30s trying to figure out what he believes in, what his core ideals are going to be, and how he's going to try to solve what he sees as state and national problems. So I want to bring us back to his early days as a governor, and from there we can see emerging the Seward that the country would recognize, always going by, even in Lincoln's White House, Governor Seward. That was always his favorite title. It was the last office he ever won electorally. He was indirectly elected as a U.S. Senator and appointed by Abraham Lincoln to Secretary of State. So these were the biggest elections in his lifetime. He once complained as he was leaving Albany that his principles were too liberal for his party. And in large part, he meant too radical. But as we'll get into, these radical principles, especially around issues like anti-slavery, would carry him as time passed from the early 1840s into the early 1860s, nearly 20 years later, as a vital part of Abraham Lincoln's team of rivals. So if it's been a little while, there we are. There's our front door. I do hope you'll plan another visit. I was just, actually, shameless plug, we are open all day tomorrow for free for the holiday. So if you're looking for an excuse to come back, tomorrow would be a great time to come. It costs you nothing but the gas money. I think we have 1 or 2 group tours who are taking advantage of it. So if you are tempted, give us a call and we can get you signed up for a free tour tomorrow. Right here at 33 South Street in Auburn, New York. Now I said emerging from the soil of Cayuga County. He was not from that soil born. William Henry Seward was born in May 1801 in downstate New York, Orange County, in a small town called Florida. The home he was born in still stands, actually. And if you go to Florida, you can visit his birthplace. It's called the Seward Mapes House now. There's a newer house, the Mapes House, right in front of it. Great sort of double dip to go down there and see both structures. That's his father, Samuel Swayze Seward. Seward was one of a large family, farming family, as I mentioned. He had 3 larger brothers, which was good for his father because Seward was about 5'3", 5'4", fully grown, and of little interest, little use to his father actually trying to work the land. And so at age 15, unlike the other boys who were made to stay home, Seward is sent to Union College in Schenectady, where at just 15, he's already so bright he tests in as a junior. Now he's got some maturity issues. He'll run away from college for pretty much a whole semester at one point, fighting with his dad over money. So he takes the full 4 years despite the head start, graduates in 1820 with a law degree. He's elected by his peers to give the commencement address, and in it, he denounces slavery. He is hired up, I'm not sure if you can read my text, I'll just share with you what's important. He is hired up right out of Union College at 19 years old at the law firm of one John Anthony on Beekman Street in New York City. And he loved New York City. As he wrote, the young lawyers and students here, less numerous than now, he's writing this in his retirement, had a literary society called the New York Forum, in which they did basically mock court. And they made some money by selling tickets to watch these young lawyers going toe-to-toe with each other and basically doing a debate club as they learned their craft and their trade, prepared for the bar exam, and as Seward imagined, on to a career as a big-time Manhattan trial lawyer. That was the plan, but history had other ideas, as it often would for William Seward. He comes home to the family farm one warm summer day, about 20 years old, and there, at home, is this young woman. Her name was Frances Miller. What you know today as the Seward House was indeed her girlhood home. Some of you may have heard me speak in Van Buren earlier in the year all about her story. She's born in Auburn in 1805. Her father built what is today the Seward House, raised her there, raised her radically as a young Quaker woman. Her father afforded her first-rate education. She'd become an equalitarian. If you've not heard that talk, I'm happy to get into it and talk about her own journey to opening her house up as a stop on the Underground Railroad, her work in abolition. And of course, Seneca Falls is the next town over from Auburn, getting involved in the women's rights movement. But as a young lady, growing up and being provided for a first-rate education, her father sends her to what is today the Emma Willard School in Troy, New York, where her classmate and soon-to-be very close friend, Cornelia Seward, enters her life. And these two girls become so close that Cornelia invites Frances to come home over the summer holiday. And it is there in William Seward's house, I'll just slide back for a second, or his boyhood home, that they meet. And Seward is drawn to her and to opportunity. Go west, young man. Along the Erie Canal, he arrives in late 1822 at 21 years old, comes to work for her father. They court. They get married in 1824. They'll have 5 children together. I have whole talks about them. Interesting social life and family dynamic. But a seismic election will radically shake this couple. And I promise you I am not going to get political about our times today. But we have seen our share of seismic elections. And for William and Frances Seward, that election saw John Quincy Adams, who would be a father figure to Seward, later in his life a political mentor, unseated by Andrew Jackson. William Seward lost himself some patronage from Governor DeWitt Clinton because he would not stay out of this election. He's drawn into it. He's young, he's idealistic, he's passionate, he loves this president. And when Adams is defeated, Seward decides in this moment he must enter the arena as an Adams man himself, taking on a northern anti-slavery cause. And we're going to get into that. He also meets during the same period of his life, in his early 20s, a man named Thurlow Weed. They meet purely by accident on the road coming out of Rochester. William and Frances have gone to Niagara Falls for a romantic trip. They have a carriage breakdown, and who should stop and help Mr. Seward but a strapping Thurlow Weed who could help Seward do what he cannot, help get the wagon up, fix the wheel. They become lifelong friends. As you can see, Weed is holding the Albany Journal. He would be the man behind the man politically for Seward for nearly 40 years, helped plan and manage his campaigns, make sure he got a lot of good press. So these two encounters in the 1820s convinced Seward perhaps politics, not the law, is where my life and passion will lead. And I want to take you now on the road to Seward's governor's mansion. That's actually Seward going up the steps. If you've been to Auburn, you know that Seward loves the little yellow house. That's his little yellow Albany house. DeWitt Clinton lived there too. Let's get him launching. Again, a bit of our timeline here. Passes the bar in 1822, becomes a partner in the Miller firm in 1823, marries Frances in 1824, and becomes active in anti-Jacksonian politics in 1828, costing himself a job in the DeWitt Clinton administration, which is reaching its conclusion after a long run. What is Seward to do? Well, the very first midterm election, the first Jackson administration, finds a young Seward, he's 29 years old, on the ballot for the New York State Senate 7th District. What is he? If you think about this period in our history, leading up to Jackson Adams, we think of it as the era of good feelings. We were a really one-party country. We'd had a Federalist Democratic-Republican split. The Federalist Party had died out, and there'd been a long run of single-party rule. The Jackson election shakes that up. But as yet, there is no political party that's taking the place of the Federalist Party. Seward doesn't even have a party to belong to or subscribe to. He's going to have to help create one. All he really has going for himself in these early days is, I'm opposed to the Jackson administration. And on that, and anti-Masonic principles, still no party identity, he is elected to the state Senate because of who he isn't. Because he isn't with Jackson, not because of who he is. And who he is and will become is what emerges out of this political period, this 1830s, 1840 period, where Seward figures out not who he isn't, not what he's opposed to, but what he believes in, and will put a party stamp and a brand and ideas behind that. So from something negative to something positive. Now, Seward likes Albany very much. He lives in above a tavern. His family can come and go as they please. The life of debates and speech making is all very exciting for this young man, but there are problems. he still lacks for political identity. His party, the anti-Jacksonian, soon-to-be Whig Party, is in the minority. And Seward is the most junior and young member, so a very deep backbencher. That said, his ambition often runs faster than his reality. And after just one term, he decides he's ready to run for governor of New York at age 33. Now, I don't want to say he gets the nomination because no other New York soon-to-be Whig wanted to run against Jackson's Democratic machine, the Regency Party of Martin Van Buren, but it sure seems like no one is terribly eager to run against Andrew Jackson, who's at the height of his powers, and his party in New York. And so in many ways, Seward is something of a sacrificial lamb. No one's going to beat Jackson's guy. No one's going to beat Martin Van Buren's machine. And their guy is William Marcy. If anybody here likes the Adirondacks, you know your 46 peaks, there's Mount Marcy and Mount Seward side by side. So Seward is trounced. He loses by about 11,000 votes, and the Democrats really run up the score in New York City, in the surrounding areas, but he also doesn't do as well as he'd hoped to do in Western New York, in the North Country. He doesn't even hold his state Senate seat. He's defeated, and it's off to exile. He writes, in his defeat, the results of a state election at that period when horseback express was the speediest method of transmitting returns, often in doubt for weeks. You might not know who won for weeks. But in this case, the triumph of the Democrats was too complete to allow the Whigs to entertain any false hope. Marcy was elected governor by a majority of over 11,000, and every district had gone Democratic, including Seward's own. The Whigs had but a feeble minority, and you can see the map there. The blue was the Democrat Party. What is Seward to do? Well, he comes back home for a while. He licks his wounds. He takes his family on a road trip. Actually, on this road trip, they go down all the way to Charlottesville, Virginia. And for Frances Seward especially, it's an eye-opening trip. She's seeing plantation slavery for the very first time in her life. New York was not a free state until the late 1820s, but she'd never seen plantation slavery. The horrors of seeing young children chained together and then whipped across a dirt road, shackled up, made to drink from a horse's trough. She made her husband turn back. This version of slavery, growing and extending to the deeper South, was revolting to her and really activates a strong anti-slavery current for her. And her husband's going to pick up a lot of this as well. But seeing Southern slavery in this form changes them. He revives a law practice. You can see his office here. He talks about really being bored. My law business drags. It's protracted by circumstances and surroundings. I sit down and commence my labor, drawing up papers every morning, calls, messages, errands, letters, interrupt every hour of the day. At this point, starting in 1834, Seward has helped bring into being in New York a party by a new name. They're called the Whig Party. They're going to have all sorts of principles. They're going to have a platform. They're going to have an identity. But really, they are still, in this Jacksonian era, the party of the loyal opposition. Seward isn't even really sure what he believes in other than he doesn't agree with Andrew Jackson, and he is ambitious and would like to not be practicing law so much. He also knows the Democrats are probably always going to hold New York City, but to be in play, his party needs a clean sweep of central New York, western New York, the North Country, the country itself. And rather than stay home, Seward entertains an offer to go to the far western edge to Chautauqua County, New York. And while he's there, he runs a land office, and he comes to really know the 6 westernmost counties in the southern tier where he'd been politically weak, and learn from them, what is it that we really need on the roughest frontier edges of New York State? What are the things that voters here care about? Seward didn't resonate with them before. They didn't vote for him. Why not? The Whig Party surely would be the party for them. The Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson was for cities. It was for newly arriving immigrant classes. The party of Jackson was a party of individualism, no big government. And what Seward thought the West needed, as Auburn received, as Phoenix would have received 10, 15 years earlier, was investments in roads and turnpikes, canals. We're the party that represents your needs out in the West. So why didn't we win there? The house where he lived, you can also visit. It's the McClurg House in Westfield, New York. We have that same fountain in our gardens that they have in theirs. And sure enough, as Seward learned, they did need the same things that central New York needed. They needed extensions of Erie Canal, past Buffalo and down south and west. They needed investments in roads. As he wrote, trying to get from Niagara to Westfield, the roads were simply horrible. They needed state investments in railroad, and Seward chaired a six-county commission that tried to bring the Erie and New York Railroad through there. He gave speech after speech in 1836 and 1837, advocating for investment of state dollars in public infrastructure. There weren't schools yet, and Seward was invited to go to help with an academy at Westfield to get it off the ground. He accepted the charge and gave a clear speech, even advocating for the education of females in public education, giving them the highest standard of literary attainment and challenging for her the same intellectual advantages enjoyed by men. Pretty radical, and it's popular in the West. What does the West really need? Now, in 1836, Jackson has a two-term limit come up. The presidency goes to Martin Van Buren. Jackson has deregulated a lot of what had been in place before him, specifically Alexander Hamilton's Bank of the United States. If you love Hamilton, you must love his bank. And it was trying to regulate the economy and prevent speculation, wildcat banking, bank failures and closures, regulated currency and script. Jackson's deregulation caused a boom of speculation, of startup banks, but it all crashes in the panic of 1837. Banks began to fail, people lose their savings, and money becomes very hard to get. And in the West, where there are bills to pay for land, especially far from eastern banks in New York, having access to money is crucial. And Andrew Jackson had signed something called the Specie Circular, which said you need banknotes, not currency, not federal currency, to buy things. What the West needs was soft money. So the West needs what Seward thought it needed, but it needed someone to be a messenger who could tie together all these threads. Public investment in internal improvements, railroads and canals, in education, building libraries, giving especially Western New York what it lacked compared to the East, which had far longer histories of development. It needed currency, it needed banks that could float money down the canal and help people get in mortgages, buy farms, buy houses, open businesses. So he becomes known as Soft Money Seward. He did not think that was an insult. So in 1838, really now Seward began to develop a consistent brand, consistent beliefs, consistent messaging, consistent speeches, where he's now not just saying, vote for me, I'm not Andrew Jackson or one of his New York surrogates. I'm not them, that's enough. I am actually now bringing forth a vision for something positive and something prescriptive. Vote for me, I am a Whig and I believe in the following. In his stump speeches, as the historian Glendon Van Dusen writes, he is hammering Governor Marcy in the lead up to the rematch for his adherence to Jacksonian small government. Seward kept before the public speaking on education, internal improvement. The major speeches were all published as pamphlets and circulated across New York. Better education, he told voters, would enable Americans to take advantage of the opportunities spread before them. There was need for the improvement of curricula for common schools and colleges. Women should have equal educational opportunities for men. And this time, Seward turns the tables. The voters of New York think a little government regulation sounds okay after such a long period of the opposite. The economy needs some managing, and in the West, the idea of this infusion of public dollars being invested sounded appealing. So he turns the tables. This time he beats Marcy by about 10,000 votes, about 52 to 48%, carrying all of upstate New York while still losing New York City. But interestingly, he wasn't bitter about losing New York. He was very positively inclined towards New York City. And in the years to come, his advisors would say, forget New York City. They don't vote for you, and they never will. We need a punitive politics to punish them. He never did it. It's a new day for New York State, going into the state grounds in Albany. He'd served 2 terms as governor of New York. It was his favorite title. And just want to read to you, I know it's really tedious sometimes when speakers read long blocks of text, but this is important, I think, because for Seward, though he would go on to achieve higher powers, this is in many ways the pinnacle. And here's why. He's never prouder of anything than being twice elected to be New York's governor. In the 19th century, state governors had considerable power. The government in Washington was not then viewed as the primary source of financing the local economy. That would come from Albany. Communities looked to the state. A governor had at his disposal a significant number of appointed positions, many requiring no confirmation from the legislature. Above and beyond this tangible authority, a governor was elected by the direct voters of his neighbors, in contrast to the president, the Electoral College, and U.S. senators at that time chosen by state legislature. A governor's influence was especially formidable in a state as important as New York. His position was one of considerable prestige, and even when Seward later served as a senator and secretary, he preferred the courtesy title governor. That is always what Lincoln called him. Not senator, not Secretary Seward, governor. Coming back to Albany, after 4 years away, he stopped by the old tavern, the Eagle Tavern, to pick up where he left off. And you know how Albany works. A lot of things get done behind closed doors, sometimes in smoke-filled rooms. So he went down to meet the power brokers, Rensselaer Schuyler. Coming back after 4 years in exile, he recorded the conversation. "I wonder what the devil sent you here." Back to Albany. "My name is Seward. I saw you at the Eagle Tavern and have seen him before." "Seward, Eagle Tavern, yes. Please take another glass." An education governor. So let me just pause for a moment. The platforms, the things that Seward realized were vital and missing during his time in the West, during his time in exile, as he developed and moved away from being a man who simply opposed Andrew Jackson's government to a man who would bring his own government to bear, he began to roll out right away new kinds of programming not seen in New York really since DeWitt Clinton, and in some cases at all. He is New York's first Whig governor. The party didn't exist. And he begins to bring a large state-present approach. I'll get into how that often costs him some trouble. In his inaugural address, he says education banishes distinctions old as time, rich and poor, master and slave. It banishes ignorance and lays the axe to the root of crime. He tours the city of New York. He tours the regions of New York State, and he sees that New York education is bifurcated. There are haves, there are have-nots, and depending on where you live and who you are, you either have an exceptional education or next to nothing. This is the same Seward who talked about educating women. He would soon talk about educating the children of immigrants, of African Americans, freed men. Equal educational opportunity for all. New York's first strong pro-immigration governor. In his same inaugural address, he says, I won't read the whole thing, I promise. "The policy of this state requires we welcome immigrants among ourselves or speed them along their way to a Western destination with all sympathy with their misfortune at home." He described his as high, liberal, and true American views, and he means a big L liberal, something for everyone, something uplifting, that the state could be a source of investment in an equalitarian way to give something to raise the standard and quality of life for everyone. He went to the mat on education, and he did so for children of the West, but also for children of New York City. When Thurlow Weed says, "Why are you spending political capital trying to get Irish immigrant children into Catholic schools?" They never voted for you. They never will vote for you. People in Western New York voted for you, and they're expecting you to deliver. He brought this high liberal sense that the state should be a tool for good across the board, and not just friends of the party, and responded that he desired to see the children of Catholics educated as well as Protestants. This is a time of, not unlike our own, bitter gridlock over immigration. And in New York, waves of Irish immigrants were coming in and being barred and excluded from entry in many places, including in New York City schools, where they were all but told they were unwelcome. New York City schools were controlled by something called the Public School Society, a discriminatory body that excluded the children of Irish immigrants. One more long speech. "Who shall teach our children?" Now, this is John Logarty, Dagger John, John Logarty's author, Dagger John, Archbishop John Hughes, who would found Fordham University, and during Seward's time as governor, was a powerful ally within the Catholic faith and in New York City politics. He disparaged the PPS, the Public School Society, as a private body of citizens controlled by these trustees, responsible for expenditures, hiring, curriculum. A large number of Catholic families boycotted the system, kept their children at home, and as more Catholic immigrants poured into New York each year, many with sons and daughters desperately needing to learn to read and write, just like in Westfield, but for different reasons, the way was shut. The future was plain to Seward, an America of mass illiteracy and social disorder, and he was not inclined to remain silent. Whether that was opening schools all the way on the edge of New York State and Chautauqua County, or investing public dollars to make fair, equitable schools in New York. Even if we have to use public dollars to allow a semblance of parochial education, using Catholic readings of the Bible as a standard of text. He also said, every child of New York State deserves access to the same highest quality of education, regardless of their situation. He made a study of where resources were most lacking in New York. He said libraries. We need libraries within arm's length of every child in New York, and invested ultimately in an 11,000 different district library sets that were distributed across New York State. So they looked like this, about 200 books that Seward himself hand-selected and had 11,000 of these printed and scattered across the state to open up knowledge to children. The ideal. A number of publishers submitted, this is a children's library in the Seward House, submitted sample libraries to Seward at cheap rates, and cases arrived at the governor's mansion, and he and his education team examined each one. In his opinion, this is him being generous to himself, at the end of looking at all these sample libraries, he said, it is doubtful if any school library has ever been submitted to such careful reading and criticism by such mature intellects as me and my team. In his annual message to the state of New York in 1840, Seward announced the project of school district libraries has been carried into operation so that every child in New York, again, regardless of gender, creed, socioeconomic status, would have what his own had here at home. This is what it looks like. There was a whole set of these in the Albany State Museum at one point. These are just some samples of what's in there. What's Seward picking? I just cherry-picked a few titles for you to see here. Lives of the Navigators, The Ornamented Discovery, History of New York in 2 volumes, Franklin's Life in 2 volumes, Farmer's Instruction in 2 volumes. Now, Seward got some static from his own party. Nativists within the Whig Party thought Seward was betraying them. You promised to go to Albany and advocate for us. You're doing what Jackson did, pouring your resources into New York City. Seward responded, why should Americans hate foreigners? It is to hate such as his forefathers were. Why should a foreigner be taught to hate Americans? It is to hate what he is most anxious his children to become. For myself, so far from hating any of my fellow citizens, I should shrink if I do not recognize them as worthy of my constant solicitude to promote their welfare. But that's not all. Big state spending Seward meant other things, contributing to the national mind. He took all those libraries and he began to catalog. He pens his own Thomas Jefferson-esque notes on the state of New York. He's investing in libraries, museums, and surveys across New York State, dividing New York into regions and making natural and geographic studies of the resources, topography, flora, and fauna of each one. He takes the final results of this, makes it all public information, and drafts his notes on the state of New York. A prison reformer. Seward's not growing up in Auburn, but a young man in Auburn, right where the Auburn prison is. That's one of the cells in the Auburn Correctional Facility. He put these libraries within every single prison and enacted equalitarian prison reforms across the board. He ordered the abolishing of whipping, ordered improved food and sanitation. He saw, I was just talking to Steve about, as governor of New York, Seward was often petitioned to grant pardons and clemency, especially to influential prisoners. And he toured prisons and realized that much like the schools, justice was a tiered system in New York. Those who had the most, there was a very famous case of a man named John Colt, brother of Samuel Colt, who basically was given silk sheets and takeout hotel food, and then everybody else is thrown on a pile of straw. He wants to create equalitarian conditions across the board. touring New York's prisons just the way he toured its schools. He says we have to have one standard, the highest standard, and even advocates that if, as he tours Sing Sing, if our system of imprisonment with silent dormitories and social labor cannot be maintained without the infliction of such punishments, these whippings and abuses, then it was established in error. Remember that trip south with Francis. As governor of New York, Seward is in a place to enact a number of powerful anti-slavery positions, really launching himself into this arena as an anti-slavery activist. The governor of Virginia, so angry at Seward because he refuses during his 2 terms to return or extradite any fugitive enslaved persons who escape the South and make it into New York State. 10 years later, the Fugitive Slave Act is going to be passed. It's going to strip states like New York from this power and make it a crime for any individual, like the Sewards with their Underground Railroad house, in assisting or facilitating such flight and freedom seeking. But when Seward is pressed to return enslaved persons, he simply says no, and that there is no law of the state which recognizes slavery, no statute which admits that one man can be the property of another or that one man can be stolen. A number of other things he does to make a big name for himself and change New York. He actually, rather than extradite fugitive enslaved persons, assigns his own attorneys general to represent their claims in court and initiate jury process. It also slows everything down, but it sees to it that there is justice and that his way is going to be covered legally. He ends what was called the 9-month travel loophole, which is to say that if a Southerner brought an enslaved person into New York, just so long as they didn't stay longer than 9 months, they wouldn't become free for having crossed into a free state. He creates a commission that investigates claims that freeborn New Yorkers of color are being kidnapped from their freedom into slavery. The most famous example, we can see a book here. It was published right in Auburn. It was Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave, his release secured by that commission. Now, what do they really need in the West? They need these improvements. He's allocating state monies to expand and widen the Erie Canal, build 3 major rail lines. In the end, there would only be 3. So we can see it now, all coming together, a concrete vision for what a proactive government can be for the life of a state like New York. It's an activist interventionist state. It's regulatory state. It's a state involved in putting controls up on banking, finance, the printing of currency, investing in public sources of good, libraries, schools, education for all, in bridge and tunnel projects. That all sounds pretty good, right? New York surely would not want to see Governor Seward leave too soon. There were no term limits. We see our governors often serving more than 2 terms. But after his 2nd term is ending, and Seward, governors of New York at the time only served 2-year terms. As his 2nd term was winding down, Seward was becoming a bit unpopular. These projects were very expensive. It requires raising taxes, and that's never a popular thing to do. Seward's own lifestyle perfectly encapsulates his style of, I don't want to say tax and spend, that's so 21st century, but maybe perhaps spending beyond prudence. As a governor of New York, the mansion he lived in, he spent more than his salary just to afford a certain lifestyle, and he left in incredible debt. I've got a stat to show you just how much. He got a warning sign in 1840. He only narrowly, 50.3% of the vote, was reelected against William Bouck, who was a canal commissioner. And Bouck was running again, and Seward saw the writing on the wall. Just like he had come back in when the Democratic Party was unpopular in the twilight of the Jackson era and unseated William Marcy, this guy was coming for him. The Democrats were about to be in the ascent. They were going to elect, soon enough, James K. Polk to the White House, and we'd be on a run for a while of the Jacksonian Democratic Party resurgence. Better to not risk defeat, go back home again, and plan again for the next thing when he was popular, when his party was popular. He had perhaps overreached, overcorrected, overinvested in the state as a tool. Now there'd be some going back, the pendulum would swing the other way, back to a more conservative small government. But he knew it's only a matter of time in a two-party system before one part or the other comes back into favorability. He was going to bide that time and bide it well. My politics, he said, are too liberal for this moment. The country's becoming conservative again. He also admitted that being governor was very hard. He was only in his early 40s, but was suffering from poor health, long, stressful, strenuous hours. He wrote that book, Notes from the State of New York, during the summer recess. All the legislators went home. He stayed in a roasting hot Albany and penned that book. He worked too long, he smoked too much, and complained always of suffering a rush of blood to the head. Now, how about that debt? We're talking 1840s dollars, millions of dollars today. Financial failings, he had lived far beyond his means and racked up $200,000 of debt for life in Albany, all those drinks at the Eagle. So he'd come home to Albany, his family, his law practice, his gardens. On his last day, he wrote to Thurlow Weed on what he saw as his reason for leaving. My politics are too liberal, too philanthropic, if it may not be vain to say so, for my party. My principles are very good and popular ones for a man out of office. They will take care of me when out of office, as they have always done. On his last day, right before the inauguration of PAC, he writes, my public career is honorably closed, and I am yet young enough, if a reasonable age is allotted to me, to repair all of the waste that private fortune it has cost. I am a mystery to myself. What am I? Well, I think, once again, he was being the opposite of him. He was being coy, because after 12 years in Albany, and 12 years in public life, and 8 years in Albany in the state senate, but especially during his time as governor, Seward had finally figured this out. He was no longer a mystery to himself. He was a rising star in the Whig Party, soon to be the Republican Party. And though that party was temporarily falling out of favor, he knew it would only be a short while before the Democrats would overreach, as they would do with their war in Mexico and their land grab. And that before long, even before the end of the 1840s, American voters, as we are wont to do, would be ready to change sides again, give the other side a chance. Let's see if they can deliver on their very different promises that they are making to us. He was no longer a mystery. He was a man who had a belief system in place. He believed in many of the things he would bring with him to Washington, that the state could be a force for good in the lives of its citizenry, that could level inequalities, bring the standard of living up for everyone, but could be a tool to fight for the rights of the disenfranchised, for women who still lack the ability to own property while married or vote in New York or have quality education, to end slavery, to invest in things like libraries, schools, railroads, infrastructure. And these are the things that when he takes his next act, returns to Washington only after another exile of about 6 years, that would make him famous, not just the state over, but across the United States during his long career as a US Senator and then Secretary of State to Lincoln. And that is another reason why I suspect he always continued to maintain that title, Governor Seward, because that was when he solved this mystery and figured out exactly who he was, what he believed in, and what he stood for. Thank you very much. I would love to take questions. Thank you. Get a good picture up here. There's a good picture. Fun story. Seward, when he left, first thing he had to do when he left the governor's mansion was figure out, okay, what's my official gubernatorial portrait going to be? What's going to hang on the walls forever? And just like with those school libraries, he had a number of artists, 5 total artists, submitted sample portraits of him. He really liked this one. This is the one that's in the Hall of Governors in Albany today when you go. He said, I look so dashing and heroic in that cape. He never wore a cape. The other one was, let me find it, this one. And in this case, his wife said, oh, it's far more accurate to what you really look like. He couldn't decide, so they actually had both artists come together. Seward flipped a coin, $50 coin. It landed tails, and so technically, though the other paintings in the Hall of Governors, back then the portraits went to City Hall in New York City. So this is his official gubernatorial portrait, and the one in Albany is his unofficial. And this one's by Henry Inman, the other one's by Chester Harding. Anyway, just the kind of man Seward was. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
How did he end up the Secretary of State under Lincoln? Lincoln was not anti-slavery.
He was not. And that is really one of the main reasons why Seward is defeated. He goes on to 12 years as a U.S. Senator, and much like he did during his time in New York, he's flashy. Remember how I told you all his speeches he prints into pamphlets? He continues that as a senator. His very first speech, his higher law speech, coming out against the Fugitive Slave Act, he had thousands of circulars put out there so the voters could read his words, and he was front and center on strong anti-slavery principles. Now, at the end of 2 terms in the Senate, coming up in 1860, thinking he's reading the tea leaves again, the Democratic Party is hopelessly split. There's a Northern Democrat, Stephen Douglas. There's a Southern Democrat. There's a Liberty Party. Like, the South has split itself into 3, like amoebas, splitting and splitting. He thinks, aha, my party has the first chance in a long time, really since, sorry for my scrolling, John Quincy Adams, to elect a Northern anti-slavery on the surface president for the first time since the 1820s. Your other Whigs were Southern Whigs. They were slaveholding Whigs. They were Zachary Taylor kind of Whigs, or William Henry Harrison kind of Whigs. And neither one makes it very long in office. Lincoln's perfect strategy against Seward, or I should say Lincoln's handlers, at the convention for their party, which gathers in May 1860 in Chicago, is they know exactly who Seward is. The voters know who Seward is. He's got a radical's reputation. He uses the words like liberal, but many would have said radical. Radical. They would have confused him with an abolitionist, as his wife was. Lincoln was truly a moderate. What they agreed on was that for Lincoln, slavery should be contained to where it currently existed and not be allowed to grow into new northwestern lands. But that was really the extent of where he saw his fight against slavery, whereas Seward's on the record saying slavery should be abolished. Together we can do it. Not consistently, not all the time. He moves back and forth across that line, but Lincoln's moderation has appeal. In Chicago, Horace Greeley himself, editor of the New York Times, walked into every state's room where all the delegates were gathered, and he said, yeah, Seward's going to fire up the base. He is beloved where the Whig or former Whig, now Republican Party, is strongest. But moderates are scared to death of him. He just went to Rochester and spoke of an irrepressible conflict. When people hear that, they think war, they think blood, they think violence and death, and they think about their children, their husbands going off. When Lincoln says a house divided, that sounds a little warmer. That sounds a little safer. Cannot stand. We need a union. So in many ways, Seward's beliefs solidified in New York, which make him good in certain moments when he comes back in the Senate and leads the charge against slavery at a time where it's really become very unpopular after the Mexican-American War. He then spends 12 years crusading, whereas Lincoln, if you think about it, during the same time period, is not in Washington. He'd been a one-term congressman and a 2-time loser for his own Senate bids. He was a dark horse. He was an outsider, and he was, we think these are modern debates, electable. He was electable. And Horace Greeley, probably rightly, walked into every room behind Thurlow Weed and said, yes, Seward will win in New England, but how's he going to play in Michigan? Now, back then, we didn't talk about swing states the way we do in modern elections. We didn't talk about red and blues. They talked about border states. What are those states that are in between the increasingly polarizing and far apart, divergent, free North and slave South? What's going to happen in Iowa? These states are going to determine the outcome of the election, and they will go for Lincoln for sure. But will they go for Seward? Much harder to say. That has a lot of appeal. And Lincoln also has far fewer enemies. He's able to not only be a moderate, but to modulate himself. And his strategy in going into Chicago was, let me be everybody's second favorite girl. If you can't dance with the one you want, settle for dancing with me. And he benefited immensely that it wasn't running against Seward head-to-head in 1860. There were 4 Republicans in the mix. It was Seward, the front runner, Lincoln, the dark horse, Salmon Chase of Ohio, and Edward Bates of Missouri. And as Bates and Chase drop out, Seward supposes he will split their delegates with others. That is not what happens. Almost every one of their delegates rallies behind Lincoln as a more electable moderate, especially on the slavery issue.
How did they get along, though, as his Secretary of State, with such differing?
Right. How did they get along? It's a wonderful question. At first, they don't. Seward is angry. He's asked, as part of a sort of conciliatory approach, to be Secretary of State. He starts bad-mouthing Lincoln before he's even appointed. He says he expects Lincoln to be the figurehead, this little lawyer from the prairie, and I, Seward, who know Washington, who am older and wiser, will be the premier, the true power source in the city. And he puts that theory to the test. In the first couple of weeks of the Lincoln administration, right before the shots are fired at Fort Sumter, he kind of invites Lincoln, he does. He sends Lincoln a memo on April 1st, the April Fool's Day memo, inviting Lincoln to cede power to him because he's failing so badly at command. And most presidents, this is the genius of Lincoln, Seward says, you're distracted by office speakers, we have no policy, Europe is at the door, the French are about to invade Mexico, the Spanish have just invaded the Dominican Republic, they are making a mockery of the Monroe Doctrine, and you are sitting on your hands. I could run things better than you. And no matter what your politics are, if you try to imagine today a subordinate walking into either the Biden or the Trump White House and inviting the president to cede power to them, you can imagine about how well that would go. But in Lincoln's White House, Lincoln says, interesting, tell me more, let's talk about it. And he invites Seward deeper into his inner circle. He says, I want this. I surrounded myself with rivals, not sycophants, because I want this hard conversation. Talk to me about the issues. Convince me you know better than I do on anything. And if you can convince me, we'll try things your way. And if not, I expect you to fall into line. Seward expects, oh, I'm more than his intellectual equal. I'm his superior. And without much time going by, he realizes that is not true. That Lincoln does have greatness, good leadership qualities, and he willingly becomes subordinate to Lincoln, so much so that by the end of his first year, he's writing home to his wife that the president is the very best of us. And Lincoln has a saying, easier to make a friend with a drop of honey than a gallon of gall. And it's that old Lincoln adage. He uses that drop of honey, he flatters his governor, Seward, as he would work most of his team of rivals, and he got the very best and the loyalty out of almost all of them.
Okay, one more.
Okay.
The Republican Party under Lincoln, which is Republicans, is actually what the Democrats are now. They're platforms. At what point did they switch?
Well, that's a really good question. It's a long history. I think different historians would give you different answers. I mean, I don't think Lincoln would recognize the Republican Party of the 1890s because it's a party that's become almost Jacksonian again. There's no regulation of these massive corporations that transform the economy. And Lincoln would have believed, like Seward, well, the state has to regulate the economy to make sure there's fairness for the small proprietors, for the farmer, for the little guy. We need a fair and equitable, well-managed system. By the 1920s, the Republican Party has undergone a progressive turn under Theodore Roosevelt. It's a different permutation that Lincoln and Seward would not have recognized. And it becomes a party of big state again. By the 1950s and 1960s, the parties do seem to be changing places. I mean, the Democratic Party adopts a big state mentality under Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a means to try to fix the Great Depression. That seems to be maybe the easiest way to answer that question is really the 1930s. But I think a historian would probably be reluctant to say it's exactly this moment, two sides change places. But I would argue that over time, even one or two generations removed, Lincoln and Seward would have a hard time recognizing the Republican Party of McKinley, of Harding as their party. So I wouldn't want to just say it, it's a contemporary thing. Lincoln wouldn't recognize the Republican Party today, but nor would he have recognized it even 30 years after his assassination. Any other questions? Cookies look pretty good. Oh, yes, sir.
Well, I have a question that really doesn't have that much to do with Seward the man. Can you go back to the picture of his boyhood home?
Yes.
What is that structure that I see looking from the top.
That's a great, I have to be honest and cop to something. I still have never been to Florida. I've gone right by it. My kid wants to go to Legoland so bad, and I've gone around. I've never actually seen it up close. It looks like a really interesting steeple, but I do not know the answer. I should call the Mapes House tomorrow and get Steve an answer, and he can circulate it amongst the members.
I think we should have a contest. We should guess something.
Where is Florida?
It's in Orange County. The next town over is Goshen. It's not terribly far from Newburgh. Yes, sir.
When I think of Seward, the Seward's Folly, I understand he has something to do with the purchase of Fair Point, Alaska.
He does, yes. That's how I met Steve, giving my Alaska talk. Now, this is maybe the least New York thing about Seward. It's very late in his career. Let's find a good picture of him. Where are you, Seward? And Seward, one of the things maybe you did not hear me mention, this would definitely have been part of his state identity, Seward and expansion. Seward and manifest destiny. That was not a New York problem. New York was already the size it was going to be when Seward was coming of age. It was already the size it was going to be when he becomes governor. You can't exactly go and conquer Ohio. There was no expansion possible in New York. And so one of the things where Seward really still has to figure out who he is on this question of manifest destiny and territorial expansion. First time he's facing these issues as a man with power is in 1849 when he goes on to the Senate. He's elected, or indirectly elected, in large part because New Yorkers are so disgruntled about what happened in Mexico. The Mexican-American War seemed a pretext to take the Texas territory and carve out a swath of land in the Southwest below the 3630 line to open it up to slavery. And that seemed like a very clear land grab. And it also seemed the South was privately funding armies. They were called filibusters. And rich Southern planters would fund private armies, basically of mercenaries, to go further south into Mexico and Central America to basically see if we can keep annexing, stir up fights, and we can provoke another war like this. So from a northern point of view, territorial expansion seemed to be advantageous and favorable for the idea of growing a slave-holding empire. When Seward gets to Washington, he is ready to tap the brakes. The state should be a regulatory agency, and expansion should be well regulated. We shouldn't just be land grabbing. And point of fact, as he says in a couple of early speeches, we still haven't built infrastructure in the West yet. There are still so many towns that don't have roads and schools and libraries and post offices. What are we doing reaching out and grabbing more before we've developed and invested in the land that we do have? So he has to figure out where he falls on that. And really, all through the war, Seward is anti-expansion or lukewarm to expansion. It is not until, with Lincoln in agreement with him, the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, the 13th Amendment is ratified, and the question of slavery is taken off the table. That no new lands ever acquired, ever again, tomorrow's Juneteenth, this is officially official now, will ever be subjected to slavery. Only then, and very late in his career, does manifest destiny and expanding the republic sound good to Seward, because he no longer worries about that. So at the same period in which he's making inroads with Russia to acquire Russian America, Alaska, he's also exploring the West Indies, Greenland, remember that was news a couple of years ago? Iceland, Cuba, and the only one that works out is Alaska because the deal is really too good, even for his enemies to pass over. And by this period of his life, with Lincoln gone and Andrew Johnson, the president, scandals and soon to be impeachment, Seward is never able to string together the sort of victories he thought he might by acquiring new lands under the name of freedom. Alaska would be the one and only one. So this is kind of a reversal for Seward. This is unlike a lot of the things we talked about where he's figuring out what he believes in as opposed to what he's opposed to. But in New York, he never really had to think about this, write about this, give speech, take the hard positions on this because it was not a New York problem, the way everything else was a New York problem. Yes?
Have you seen more about Francis
Oh, I wish you'd come to my talk in Van Buren last time. It was all about Frances, but I would be delighted to. I do have a whole talk, and I don't think we recorded it. But Frances has her own career, largely on the grassroots level. It is to, can I pull up the presentation? Let's see if I can find real quick. Can I find you? I don't know where you are, Frances. I'll breeze you through.
Let's come back and do it.
I promise I will. Frances and her children, Frances and her sister, her education, Henry. But I want to show you the Underground Railroad. And Frances, involved in women's rights politics in the 1830s and 1840s, as First Lady of New York, that's really her legacy, is she's advocating for a property rights bill for married women. After that, 1851, when her husband goes to Washington, she largely stays home. She inherits the house. This is our downstairs kitchen, which was used as a stop on the Underground Railroad. And of course, she will be able to sell, I can find Harriet Tubman. I must have taken her out because this talk was just about women's rights. Great reading is The Agitators by Dorothy Wickenden, who many of you may have just seen in Aurora, that connects her story to Harriet Tubman's and Martha Coffin's rights. So in short, though, active career in the women's rights movement, especially for property rights for women, and an abolitionist who would both convert her home to a stop on the Underground Railroad, who would sell land to Harriet Tubman, and who would even help her husband draft his famous higher law speech that I talked about earlier, when he is saying there's a higher law than the Constitution coming out to condemn the Fugitive Slave Act, and making sure that many, many copies of that were printed and especially sent back to good old New York.
You did say last time, for a wife of a politician at the time, she had tremendous influence over Stewart. Toward women in Africa.
She did. He often rehearsed speeches in front of her. Their letters together are full of her responding to things he's saying when she's with him. They have something of a political partnership. A historian of Frances writes, to a remarkable degree, he wanted her to weigh in and share her unvarnished opinion because he knew what an asset she was, intellectual, formidable. She already knew from an early age who she was, what she stood for. Unlike him, she had it figured out earlier. But as a woman, she was ineligible from holding office, even voting. She had to help Henry along in his own journey to figure out who he was and what he stood for. A lot like an Abigail Adams. It's a really good comparison. I'll unplug this. But clearly I have a lot of talks, so I'm happy to come back and give any of them. Was there another question?
Separately, because he was in Albany or he was in Washington, all of this was by letters. They didn't have
Yes.
things.
I closed it, but half that slideshow was me just showing you letters of them arguing. Oh, well, absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.